Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, a special episode of the I Am Conquering Mountains podcast. I'm your host, Charles Phillips, also known as I Am Conquering Mountains. We have two very special guests joining the show today. They are two expert individuals in their field. We have been talking a lot about the obstacles that many people endure. One recurring thing that we have heard from the guests that have been on the show is the childhood trauma that each one has endured, from child abuse and neglect to witnessing domestic violence, even testifying against one's parents for the child abuse that they have endured. I am also a survivor of childhood trauma as well, dealing with child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, poverty, moving from place to place 18 times by the time I turned 18. And well into the 30s by the time I graduated college at 23. So this is a subject that is very near and dear to me. We have two very special guests. One is Miss Renee DeBoer Lucas. She is a licensed psychologist with over 15 years of experience treating trauma and related concerns in children, teens, and adults. She has certifications and trainings in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and prolonged exposure for adolescents and adults. She has served as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maryland, completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She is also a published author of several books, chapters, and also articles that you can read. And she is the executive director, co-founder, and board chair of the True Trauma Center, whose mission is to increase access to trauma-focused and evidence-based care and prevention services for children and families in the DC area. And we also have joining with us Ms. Stephanie Wolf, who is also a licensed psychologist who also has 15 years of experience treating and assessing children and adults who have experienced trauma. She also has certifications and trainings in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, parent-child interaction therapy, Circle of Security, parenting program, child family traumatic stress intervention, alternative for families, cognitive behavioral therapy, and problematic sexual behavioral cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. She also currently provides trauma therapy to children and families in multiple outpatient settings. And she also has her Juris Doctorate as well, where she can practice law and also serves as an expert witness in trials for different types of cases in the court system. So I definitely want to welcome Ms. Stephanie Wolf and Ms. Renee Lucas to the show of the I Am Conquering Mountains podcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Thank you. Like I said, this is a subject that is very near and dear to me that I'm excited to engage in conversations about. As one who I work as a school counselor, and I've had many students who have endured childhood or are enduring childhood trauma. And we know, we'll talk about a little later on in the show as well, too, from the pandemic, a lot of those kids are experiencing that childhood trauma for the very first time. And we definitely want to get some insight on that as well. So my first question that I have for you guys, and I would like each of you to answer, and I'll start with Ms. Renee. Mm-hmm. What is childhood trauma? If you had to give a definition of it, what is childhood trauma?
What is childhood trauma? So it's a really good question. And it's really anything that a child witnesses or that a child experiences that impacts them profoundly, right? It impacts their functioning. So just that's essentially how they move about in the world, at school, at home, with friends. It can cover a lot of different topics. So it can cover physical abuse, sexual abuse, like you said, domestic violence, violence in the community. There can be immigration-related trauma, trauma in a home country before someone leaves or also during the process, scary or painful medical treatment. It really can be a whole lot of things, right? And it's pretty subjective. You could have a kid experience a trauma that's the same as another child, but maybe only one of them develops symptoms. Right.
Okay.
So that's something that's important to keep in mind.
Nice.
And I'll there's always more I could say, but I'll let Stephanie say something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Renee covered most of it, but the only addition that I would probably add is just that there's also kind of collective versus individual traumas.
Okay.
And so and even those can vary as far as how they affect people. So, perfect example is the pandemic, right? For many, it's been a collective trauma. For some, not, right? Some actually have had a lot of, there's been a lot of positives from the pandemic. But it's, for the collective society, it has been, for the most part, extraordinarily traumatic. And then, that collective experience and how we interact, that is also trauma.
Sorry, go ahead.
So that, when we think about trauma as car accidents and abuse, and, that's kind of from an individual level, but then we can also have a trauma as a society, right? And as a world in the pandemic sense.
So when you say collective versus individual, is that referring to, like how you mentioned the pandemic, that's something that we all are witnessing, but then we have we each have an individual experience in regards to that as well too?
Yes, exactly. So collectively, policies and approaches are being tailored in response to that collective trauma, right? A lot of what we do, collectively, child development has been, profoundly impacted by kids not being in schools in the same way, not having the social interactions, that kind of thing. But then individually, it really does vary because, depending on a person's home life and resources that are available, that impact may be entirely different.
And then traumas interact with each other too, another collective trauma, racial trauma, just racism, discrimination, ways that communities of color are treated, mistreated, and that factors into the pandemic, right? Because we know that Black and Brown communities have had a harder hit, in terms of experiences and responses and things like that, right?
So trauma can be, it can be related to a plethora of things. It doesn't necessarily, because I think a lot of times when people hear trauma, they're thinking that, there is this, well, a lot of times what I get when people hear trauma is that they're thinking that it's some type of violence against this other individual, or this other, or especially when we're in regards to children, a lot of it is related to parent abuse or child abuse from a parent or a guardian, but it can be a plethora of things.
Yes, it can be a lot of things. And one other thing to add is it can come in different formats. In addition to what we said, it can be things that you've experienced yourself, that a child has had directly happen to them. It can be things that a child has witnessed, right? They could see violence happen to someone. They could see someone be involved in a car accident. And it also can pertain to things that you've heard have happened to someone. I know that my grandma had this thing happen to her. I know that my brother, had a really scary medical treatment, right? So those things all can factor in.
And also how we define trauma can vary culturally, right? So, what culture you're in, what language you speak, etc. One experience may be considered traumatic by a culture in general, whereas a different culture may see that type of experience as normative and not traumatic, and may define it differently, which then leads to different reactions. There's universal traumas that we can imagine, right, such as death, those types of things. But then beyond that, there is kind of a cultural aspect to how we define it and what we think about it. And the final thing I would say with just kind of the definition of trauma is also the additive effect about multiple traumas. And so that there have been, I'm sure you've heard of the ACEs that, which are, adverse,
childhood
experiences that occur. And what we know from all kinds of research and just from life experience is that the more types of ACEs, the more types of different traumas a child has, then the worse outcomes they tend to have as far as success in life, trauma symptoms, etc. There's this additive effect, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to identify when a trauma is happening, prevent it, have these types of discussions.
And I'm glad you brought up the ACEs because, and for those listening, ACEs stands for, as Dr. Wolf said, adverse childhood experiences. And I was reading on the CDC's website that they had surveyed adults across 25 states, and 61% of them had reported they had at least one adverse childhood experience.
Mhm.
And 1 in 6 had reported that they had 4 or more.
Mhm.
So for a person that has experienced childhood trauma, what kind of behaviors do we see out of those children?
Oh, so I can go ahead and speak to that.
I just monopolized, so that was
No, that's okay.
I'll make sure I ask each individual. As
No
well.
problem.
It really can depend on, the age of the person, right?
Mhm.
It's going to really depend on how old the person is. So if we're looking at really little kids, say kids under 2, maybe they aren't eating the way that they normally do. Maybe their sleeping patterns are different. Maybe they're crying a lot and it's really hard to console them. Right.
Okay.
But for kids who are more in that school age range, maybe they're up to 6 or so. Maybe it's harder for them to concentrate in school. It's hard for them to focus on their learning, like you said earlier.
Mhm.
They act out more, so kids act out more with their bodies as opposed to telling us, maybe what's on their mind. And so you might see a child having more, acting out, more like explosive behavior. Lack of confidence, like those sorts of things can come up. For teens, they tend to feel, more self-conscious, to have
Okay.
shame and guilt and, those complicated feelings that they carry with trauma. Teens don't want to be different than their peers. So there's a lot of worry about, am I strange? Is something different? Is there something wrong? And you'll sometimes see teens, get into kind of rule breaking stuff. Sometimes they'll get involved in substances, those sorts of things. Sometimes risky sexual behaviors and things that might get them in trouble. So I'm sure there's more to add, but that's a little bit of a place to start.
And Ms. Wolf, you had mentioned that the definition of trauma can be defined differently in different cultures. Have you seen where it's defined differently by different generations, where one parent may say, or one kid may say, I have experienced X, Y, and Z, and then that parent says, well, that's not really that, because this is what I'm.
Absolutely, yeah. So and there's a whole kind of a body of research that looked into the intergenerational transmission of trauma, right? When a trauma happens to a person and then they grow older, they have children, and then sometimes they transmit some of the trauma that they experienced onto their children, onto their offspring, and they have a reaction based on that trauma. And so it can be the cyclical thing. But absolutely, the definition can change generationally, right? Sometimes we see caregivers that may have experienced physical abuse, right? That's an example that I've seen quite a bit, who did not define it as a traumatic experience, based on just what happened. That was discipline. That was, didn't happen that often, or they were able to, just have the way that they defined it and interpreted it for whatever reason, didn't reach a level where it was a traumatic experience for them. But then, maybe their children, are having that experience. Maybe they're also, those parents are using physical discipline, and those children, may potentially define it differently, right? And may find that it's, invasive and, distressing and, may lead to traumatic symptoms, et cetera. And that can be really confusing, right? That can be confusing within a family system. If a parent, has a child that is, identifying that an experience is traumatic for them and is having symptoms, and they themselves have experienced it and did not feel that way. And so being able to then get help and understand, it can create some division within that family unit.
And Miss Lucas, what does it do to a child when a parent says something like that, where a child may say that, yes, I was abused, but then the parent says, well, that's not abuse. This is what I went through, that's abuse. What does that do to the child?
It can feel really invalidating, right? It might not be the intention, right? But it can feel like the child's not understood. It can leave them, like Dr. Wolf said, feeling confused and wondering, did I experience what I thought I experienced? I've certainly seen situations where a parent and a child have experienced the same trauma, and sometimes it increases empathy and understanding and support. but there are times that, I've seen, well, that happened to me and I turned out fine, so I think it can be really confusing and unfortunately invalidating. And sometimes it can be a barrier to accessing care, right? Because if the parent thinks you're fine, they would maybe be less likely to seek care if their kid is having a hard time.
That's a good point that you mentioned, that, it can be very invalidating, because I often see that in the school system as well, too, where I'm sharing with a parent the concerns that the kid is having, and they're saying, it's kind of dismissive, where they are saying that, well, I went through X, Y, and Z, and if I endured it and I overcame it, then so can my child too. And then it does result in them not seeking care for, that child. So, and if you had to give advice to someone like myself who's a school counselor, or to a teacher, how can you structure that message to the parent, where that parent kind of gets to, where that parent is coming around the corner where they're saying, well, yes, this is an issue that I need to get my child help for?
I would be happy to answer that. I don't know who if that was directed toward
both.
Okay. I think that often framing it from you don't have to agree with the feeling, right? Just because you're validating doesn't mean you're saying, yes, this is absolutely correct, and I think I'm glad that you're having this feeling, but recognizing the feeling, right? So joining in, hey, as my child, I hear that you have a lot of pain around this. I hear the pain that you're having. I hear the anger. I hear the sadness about this. And so validating and joining with that feeling is different than saying, yeah, I get why you have this. I've had this too. And so it can be hard to differentiate, but it can be really powerful too. And giving parents permission to have their own experience, but still be able to help their child. And, often I find explaining to parents why it's really helpful and important to be able to validate, despite not necessarily agreeing.
Right.
Yeah. And something that I might add to that is empathizing with what the parent experienced. You went through something tough. You shouldn't have experienced that. You can help your child have a different experience, right? Because maybe that parent, got through it, but maybe they had some internal struggles. Maybe they had some things that were more challenging than they needed to be, right? So helping their child to have a different experience. And then maybe too, referencing what we were talking about earlier, where trauma is subjective, right? Maybe it didn't impact you in this way, but your child is having a different experience, for various different reasons. They're having a different go of this. And so emphasizing that. I think that's one piece. And then maybe one more thing is thinking about the fact that when kids experience trauma at a younger age, it can set them up for some tougher things down the road, right? And so if we can intervene now and help a kid now to get on, a path, of healing, it's going to set them up for more success as an adult.
So, and I'll start with you, Ms. Lucas. What can a child do if the parent is not seeking mental health treatment for that child as they are enduring the trauma?
All right, thanks, Stephanie. I think he was asking you.
Oh, I thought you said Ms. Lucas.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was starting with Dr. Lucas.
That's okay. Can you say the question again?
So if a parent has that situation, so if you have that situation, so like, for instance, if I'm a school counselor and I'm telling a parent that, hey, your child just disclosed to me that they're experiencing anxiety, and the reason they're experiencing this anxiety is because they've had a uncle touch them or hurt them in some type of way, and that parent is in complete denial of that. But that child still needs to get some type of treatment. What is some advice you could give an educator working with that student to support that student if the parent is not getting them the treatment that they need?
Right. I think it's something that they can maybe work with the family a little bit more to help them understand, the impact on how the child is doing at school. A lot of times, even if a family might not feel the same way about this shouldn't impact you, or maybe this isn't something to bring up anxiety, a lot of times they'll want their kid to be able to focus, to be able to function and, learn. And so sometimes emphasizing the places where that could make that challenging, could potentially be helpful. Dr. Wolf, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that students could still seek support from their school counselor, right? I wasn't quite sure if they needed permission from the parents to do that.
Usually
But
not. I mean, it can, you know, some states or schools are different, but for the most part, you know, as you know, Charles is the expert. With however, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the other thing, and we find this so much, unfortunately, but teaching coping, right? Helping kids with how to manage the feelings they're having, you know, how, you know, validating them as a professional, and that can go a far way, right? So ideally we have a caregiver that's like, yeah, you know, I get you, you know, I want to help you, I see you're struggling, but the reality is oftentimes we don't, right? Oftentimes our caregivers, you know, are not as best as we wish they would be. But that's where, you know, having amazing school counselors, having warm teachers, having a caring adult or guardian around, who can validate, who can provide coping, who can provide hope, can be really powerful. You know, I recall, you know, many years ago having a child that I was seeing who whose mother did not believe that she'd been sexually abused. It was really traumatic for her, and I was working with both her and her mother a lot. And even, you know, by the end of the trauma treatment, her mom recognized that she was having trauma symptoms and trauma things, but just was like, and I still don't think this happened. Maybe there's other things. And I remember the child saying to me, you know, now that I've finished treatment, it is, you know, it's okay that my mom doesn't believe me because you believe me. And that always stuck with me. And I think is just, you know, really demonstrates the power of somebody on your side, right? Somebody on that side of that child who gets it, who cares.
Because that's very empowering, you know, and because I often have those conversations with my students where they have these situations that they're having, and some of it is not, you know, to the point where there is abuse in the home or anything like that, but they have these issues that are impacting their mental health. And oftentimes I hear the parents say, oh, it's just a phase. You know, this anxiety that they're dealing with, or this depression that they're dealing with, is because of their hormones are changing because they're becoming of age. And, you know, I often have to sit with the kid and I have to share that same sentiment that you shared, that, yeah, okay, your mom or dad may not understand completely what anxiety is. And for some cases that is. And, you know, my parents, they didn't understand what mental health was, or the depths of the anxiety that I was experiencing, which is why I didn't know that I had anxiety disorder until I was 27 and going into treatment. So what are some of the dangers that a person can find themselves going into if that trauma goes untreated? What kind of things can we find a person finding themselves going into if they don't have that trauma treated? And I'll start with you, Ms. Wolf.
So it's a great question. The first thing I want to say before that is that sometimes, you know, as in your case, you know, people are really resilient. Kids are really resilient, and that even if you know, didn't know until you were 27 that you had an anxiety disorder and all of that, you had incredible resilience to, you know, be able to kind of move forward despite really challenging circumstances. And so, you know, that's one of the things I love about working with kids and with adults, but especially kids, is just that there's so much resilience there, and we don't necessarily know why some kids are able to and others aren't. And there's all kinds of studies and research that looks at that, and, you know, we can parse that out some. But really, you know, for the kids and adults that struggle with trauma and don't get treatment, you know, it can really profoundly derail one's life, unfortunately, right? So in the early years, you know, we often see learning impacted, that there's brain structural changes, you know, being in that flight or fight mode, all those chemicals in the brain and having those rushing all the time can really impact how your brain develops, unfortunately, right? Can cause learning disabilities and impulse control problems and all that kinds of stuff. It can also cause interpersonal issues, right? So it can confuse kids as to healthy relationships. You know, if there's an interpersonal trauma that's happening, you know, expectations and all that kind of thing. In an extreme way, you know, it can lead to psychosis, having hallucinations, that kind of thing, when the abuse is so profound that the brain literally can't tolerate it. So it has to kind of seek reality somewhere else. You know, those are more extreme circumstances, but also can be treated. But it can lead to really, you know, depending on on the person, and depending on the types of trauma and all those other factors, it can lead to real severe negative impacts and loss of functioning.
And we talk about like different activities and things that they can find themselves in. Do you find that it leads kids into at-risk behaviors like engaging in substance abuse, alcoholism, things of that nature?
Absolutely. So there's often, kids will either become, and some have a combination of both, internalizers, where they're having all this anxiety, they're feeling very sad, having lots of depression, sometimes self-harming, sometimes having thoughts of killing themselves or even trying to kill themselves in their life. Or we oftentimes have the externalizers. And again, we can have a combination. And those kids, the externalizers, tend to be the ones that turn towards more risky behaviors, that may, try to self-soothe, right? They feel so bad that they use alcohol or drugs to treat and to kind of escape from what's happening to them. We also see, promiscuity as a response, engaging in, criminality, all that kinds of stuff, often have a trauma component to it. Back in my training, when I was a younger psychologist, I'm still young, but I was younger, put that out there. I did a training at a juvenile detention center, a maximum security juvenile detention center in Richmond. And I'll never forget just being struck about, the children that I worked with. And I was working with the girls in the detention center, and probably, over the course of my months and months there, probably, interacted with 70, 80 girls. And I would say about 95, 96% had just really intensive trauma backgrounds, really, really horrific trauma backgrounds. And I think, so when we think about, leading to substance abuse and all kinds of risky behaviors, the proof is in the pudding, if you will, and seeing that so many of our incarcerated youth and so many of our incarcerated adults are there because, a big precipitator was just lots of trauma.
And unfortunately, we know too that those patterns can continue into adulthood. So if somebody has experienced a trauma, you're unfortunately more vulnerable to those happening again, for a lot of the reasons that, Stephanie mentioned, and then also if you're using substances to cope, you're not quite aware of, what's going on around you at times. And so you can be more vulnerable to making choices that are unhealthy for you or for others or for additional things, happening to you. And also, when folks experience a lot of trauma, it also can lead to, medical concerns, right, over time, right? Just kind of the accrual of all that stress and, ongoing symptoms, right? Just the major stress on the body.
And earlier death. I mean, taking that even a step further, right? We can have, a higher incidence of all those illnesses, really severe illnesses, and right. Ending of one's life earlier.
Yeah. And I read that, I can't remember what study I was reading, but I read that in regards to that topic that you just brought up, Ms. Lucas, that a lot of kids who go through that, who experience childhood trauma, especially like poverty, end up having a lot of health issues as well, as far as like arthritis, back issues. Because I've had two surgeries on my back. One recently was last year at a double lumbar fusion, and I'm like, man, I'm only 35. Why is my back going in pain, and why am I having to have this major operation that people don't usually have later on until adulthood or whatnot? But I was just reading up on poverty and education, but also one's health as well. So the point that you just made about, those, not just the risky behaviors that people experience engaging in substance abuse, but also, the health crisis that also come into play with that as well, because especially in, the Black and Brown community, where access to healthcare isn't as great as we would like, but also the education to that as well too. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Lucas, and please chime in, Ms. Dr. Wolf as well, with the True Trauma Center. How is the True Trauma Center going to help to not fix that problem, but try to bridge that gap?
We're going to fix it.
I wish.
Might take a little while, but we're.
how is the True Trauma Center going to help to kind of bring access to healthcare
Mhm.
for those who need it most?
Yeah. Well, like you said, part of a central part of our mission is to increase access to care. And so one of the ways that, one of the big barriers to care is, the cost of treatment. And so, we plan to use a sliding scale and really to have the ability to pay not be a barrier, right?
Yes.
That's something that really, we use evidence-based treatments, and that really means that we know treatments that work and that work more quickly, than other types of treatments. And really, I feel like that's just a basic human right to have access to that type of care. It should not be the wealthy. It should not be that you could buy a car or seek mental health, treatment. And so that's one big piece that we're hoping to reduce some of the cost, barrier. Starting in the fall, we're planning to offer informational talks to the community. So, giving folks information about what trauma looks like, ways to recognize, how to help connect their kids to care. Also on that prevention end, if you recognize those pieces early, if you know ways to manage stress, that can help to prevent, some types of child abuse. Also, around the fall, we're going to be offering therapy, the evidence-based treatment for children and families that have experienced trauma. And that's something that we know, if caregivers are able to be involved, these treatments are really helpful for both the kids and for the caregivers. But even if they can't, the kids are able to benefit, independently. So that's, those are some ways. And a little bit farther down the line, but still on our, agenda, is to offer what we call immigration evaluations. And so those are folks who may be seeking asylum status or refugee status. And a huge number of people who go to court don't get the status that they were seeking. But we actually know that when people can get evaluations that we can offer and take a report to court with them, they're actually 90% of people are able to get the status that they were looking for.
So that is definitely going to be a blessing for a lot of people.
We hope.
Yeah.
And for kids who are unaccompanied, that's going to be a huge thing that that they will have access to. And so that, and then you referenced a bit earlier, I know there's a lot, so bear with me.
That's okay, go ahead.
Keep talking about it.
You all mentioned, problematic sexual behaviors before. And so that's something that, we will be able to offer treatment that specifically is aimed at helping, kids and families where their child has been involved in inappropriate touching or inappropriate viewing of body parts. And it really is, very effective. Kids who go through that treatment, benefit in so many different ways.
I'm happy to talk about that piece.
Yeah, no, happy to let
a little bit more. I'm a trainer in the model of problematic behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a mouthful. Say it 10 times.
A lot of acronyms.
A lot of acronyms. But really, that's one of our most powerful preventative steps, beyond just education, right? The education, as Dr. DeBoer Lucas talked about, really educating the community, going into schools, being on podcasts like this, right? Trying to reach people to kind of tell them, this is trauma, let's talk about it, let's talk about symptoms, let's talk about how to help, and then let's increase the access. But then with PSB CBT, it's really identifying kids that act out sexually on others. And it happens everywhere. It happens so much, but it's one of those things that nobody wants to talk about, right? It happens in every school. It happens in every camp. It happens within families, between siblings and cousins. And when it happens, it's very shameful. It's very scary. And often the child that's acted upon is traumatized, but the child that did the acting out is not a criminal, right? But is often treated like a criminal, is often taken out of the community, is put in residential care, is often incarcerated, etc., and then gets traumatized by those experiences, right? And then gets worse instead of better, and families are really destroyed. And so, this is a treatment that is really becoming more and more accessible, but it is hard to find. And it is a huge preventative piece that we plan to offer relatively soon at the True Center, and do other preventative stuff as well.
So I have a question, and both of y'all can answer. One of the reasons I believe that in my household growing up that they didn't access healthcare for myself was due to the lack of education of what mental health and the impact of mental health could be. So the info talks, what can people expect out of those info talks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the pieces that we really are working on and we would love help on if anybody's listening, or, even Charles, if you have any ideas, is really creating some partnerships with people already in the communities that we're trying to reach to help guide us even more than what we're doing. So we're, looking into how best to get those messages out there. Really, it's just breaking it down to kind of, hey, what are the problems that you're having right now with your child, right? What is your child experiencing? And then helping explain how we can help with that, right? So it's really, concrete information that is usable. Right. It's not, a lot of times there's a lot of misconceptions as far as mental health treatment, or that somebody must be crazy if they're going to, and that, or we can't trust these, these people that are talking all this stuff, or, they don't know my kid, I know my kid, that kind of thing. And so, often it's really just kind of joining with people and being like, you are the expert in your child, right? We are not going to come in, and we can't come in and say, this is wrong, you're doing this wrong, and anything like that. But what we can say is, look, your kid is getting into trouble a lot at school. And, and we understand that this child has, was in 3 foster homes. And, maybe it's worth looking and saying, like, is that affecting him? And, is there something, how can we help you help him? And how can we make, your family work a little bit better? Because what's happening right now isn't working so well for you. So it's really, trying to break it down into ways that people can understand how it can help them. And it really can be simple, right? It doesn't have to be this jargony, like, we are going to do this long treatment with you, right? It's really just having that discussion.
Exactly. And I think too, some of the informational talks will be live, and so people will have the chance to
good.
ask questions, and so that I think will be really helpful, because then people can chime in and ask things, and we can tailor information, to the audience that we're speaking to. But I really like what, Stephanie said about partnerships too, because we don't want to be white saviors. We don't want to come in and pretend to have all the answers and that sort of thing. So really partnering with folks that, have been there, have been in the community, even longer than we have, and we can provide kind of joint messaging.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that as well too. Because oftentimes, and we talk about it in the school system as well, where people will kind of attach to Caucasians or white individuals, the white savior complex or whatnot. But you're really just out there trying to help do your part, and provide the expertise that you have, and help those children and families and caretakers and guardians get to where they need to be as far as getting that trauma addressed. So I definitely.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's systemic reasons why a lot of clinicians look like Stephanie and I, right? There just are so many systemic reasons that has happened. And, we want to be aware of, the ways that it can feel like white saviorism, right? It doesn't actually offend me if somebody has that feeling, because, we want to increase access to care. There have been systemic reasons that trauma happens, more often in, communities of color, that the care, isn't always there, and so we just want to be able to provide the message and the treatment that we can.
And really, one of the impetuses for all of us as founders was just noting the lack of available evidence-based treatments to all of these underserved communities, right? That, and they're the ones that are out there, they're very pigeonholed, right? Like, so we have, there are some amazing services offered in our community from so many great organizations, but a lot of it is like, okay, if your child has abuse, you can go here. And if your child, has grief, they can go here. And we really wanted a place, and hope to build a place that is recognized as a central place for trauma, all for all kids. And that also people can call, right? So we're doing these informational talks, we're going to have question and answers, but we're also, we're going to have consults as part of our early service. And so what that means is any parent, anybody, any teacher can call us and talk to, a clinician and ask questions and get that one-on-one information. And then either we can help or we can help send them to a place that can get help.
Nice. And so I have a question. Of course I have a question. So I'll start with you, Miss Lucas, Dr. Lucas, sorry.
That's good.
What barriers, and I have a reason for asking this, what barriers does religion play in access or seeking out mental health treatment?
That is a good question. Sometimes there is the idea of keeping, whether it's family business within the family, that can be a piece. There sometimes is, in working with different families, of faith, they'll talk about praying on it or talking to the minister or, somebody like that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? There are times that might not be enough, and that we want families to know when, it might cross, that need from, talking to the minister to talking to a mental health clinician. But I think sometimes there can be I can handle what God sends me, right? Or, this is a test of strength and that sort of thing. And so sometimes there can be that feeling. But, it's something that everybody, whether it's, seeking that support in the church or in the synagogue or outside, recognizing when it, might be helpful to seek help from, a mental health professional.
I think also a barrier, that I've often found is that, sometimes there's more of a comfort with somebody of your same faith, right? Sometimes there's this craving, right? When somebody is really, really, very religious and really, leans on that for their strength, then often it's really important for them to be able to meet with somebody who is a therapist, if they're going, kind of beyond a minister or within their church or temple or wherever, but to feel like you get me, right? You understand me.
Right.
You can incorporate my faith into how you're helping me. And I think that as mental health providers, oftentimes we don't do a great job of that. I think that the field is moving in more of the direction of embracing that, but I think sometimes mental health providers have been a little dismissive of that, and I think that there's more of a movement to being able to embrace, hey, if somebody is a huge, really strong believer and has leans on that's wonderful, and even if you're not of the same faith, we can incorporate that into whatever treatment we're doing, right? I mean, there's tons of research that talks about, people that believe in God and believe in that, it truly is, it can really make such a huge difference in their coping and being able to get through stuff. And so it needs to be something that's embraced versus kind of shied away from.
Right. I asked that question because growing up, I think that was one of the reasons that my parents didn't, I don't know if they necessarily recognize what I was dealing with the anxiety and the PTSD and depression. But whenever I would get nervous or anxious or something was going on, they would just say, well, just pray about it.
Yeah.
And I'm a minister as well.
Oh,
I'm a minister as well. So, and what I've found in my studies is that prayer is never passive. It always leads you into action. So you pray for a house, it's not going to fall out of the sky. You actually fulfill the steps to get that house. So when I think about, seeking help for mental health treatment, like dealing with my anxiety, and it can be very painful and depressing, even dealing with that anxiety, where I couldn't really break through it, and I'm praying about it. Okay, now I need to do something to take action. Where I have to actually go and seek treatment for this mental health issue. We often go seek treatment to the doctor when we have, upset stomach, or we break our arm, or something's happening within our body physically. We go seek treatment. I feel like God put individuals like yourselves on this earth as well to study the mind, so that we can get that help as well too.
Mhm.
You know, so, and that's why I asked that question, because I feel like that's often a barrier.
Absolutely. I love how you stated that and explained that. I think that that's definitely very true. And I like thinking about utilizing prayer in the way that you described as kind of a jumping off point, right? If you will, the prayer gets you to take those additional steps on some level.
Right. And I think it's part of doing what we call culturally competent treatment, right? You don't have to be of the same culture to be aware of the impact that that culture can have. And it's not to minimize in any way what, you know, Stephanie was saying about feeling in line and feeling supported by somebody of the same culture, but just being able to recognize, you know, culture has a powerful impact, you know, to ask somebody, how does your culture impact? How does your faith impact, you know, those sorts of things. And really, you know, helping clinicians to feel comfortable with that, I think makes a huge difference. I've worked with a lot of clients who don't look like me. And when I say, what does it feel like talking to a white woman about this? Or, you know, I don't live in the same fear of police, you know, what's that like? You know, I've seen people let their shoulders almost come down, or it's like, okay, even if I don't get it in the same way, I get that it's a thing, right? And so I think that's important for people to bring into the room.
And being willing to even address it, right? Because, you know, we definitely, similar to Dr. DeWard Lucas, right? You know, I work with a lot of people that don't look like me. And also, you know, really opening up and being like, let's talk about this. This is a thing. How does it feel to be in a room with someone that doesn't look anything like you? And, you know, and oftentimes people don't want to be the explainer, right? I don't want to explain to you how it is and what it's like, you know, being a brown person and what I go through, right? Like, I don't want to be that person, which is allowed, right? That's okay. You don't have to be that person, but we can at least recognize that this is a difference between us. And then at least that gets us closer to feeling understood and heard and being able to work together.
So when an individual, for instance, like you mentioned that a lot of therapists kind of shy away from those type of conversations about culture, how do you get someone to embrace that conversation, especially when someone is who's a person of color like myself, who is impacted by what they see happening on the news with police brutality, and that it oftentimes results in death, like the George Floyd case?
Yeah. I think being able to acknowledge and to check in, right? I think even just starting that conversation, right? You know, I saw this in the news, you know, how is this impacting you? Being the first one to bring it up, I think, is really important as an icebreaker, right? Because, you know, as I've gotten to know different clients, you know, of color, we've worked together. They'll mention later, I didn't want to say anything, but, you know, I wasn't sure how this white lady was going to help me, or, you know, that sort of thing. So I think just being the one to bring the elephant into the room, to acknowledge it, to say, this is a thing, you know, people like me have not treated you well, you know, there's a reason for that mistrust to be there. How can we work on it? Right?
And I'm not perfect too, right? So I think, you know, understanding that I may have these conversations and bring it up and be clunky. I don't have all the answers. I may mess it up in some way, but let's just keep talking, right? You know, let's keep having the conversation. And I think that's where the True Center, you know, is, you know, one of our really, you know, important values is to kind of diversity, to be able to have these conversations and not just say it, but actually live it and do it, right? And so by bringing it up, by talking about it, by getting the clinicians that are working with us, you know, as part of the True Center, being willing to have those conversations, training them, getting trainings for us, right? We're constantly looking for more education, ways that we can improve, feedback. You know, did I say something that really did not sit well with you? Please tell me. Right? Let's talk about it. I'm so very, very imperfect.
And I greatly appreciate the things that you all are sharing, especially like making sure that people are willing to dive into the conversation and even ask, you know, because, you know, oftentimes, you know, we can kind of, or people want to shy away from those conversations, you know, and, you know, often educating oneself on how something is impacting a person of color, you know, if you're and kind of, you know, I mean, you might not be able to experience it 100%, but you have to empathize, you know, and I think, you know, what you guys are doing with, you know, asking those questions about how they are impacted by something, or if I said something that, you know, I didn't intend to affect, impact you, but I know it did have a negative impact on you.
Mhm.
So asking those questions definitely does go a long way, because it shows that, you are invested in that individual, and, you're willing to correct those mistakes as well too. So definitely applaud you guys for doing that as well too.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that we hope that makes a difference. And, I've seen, times where it seems like that has helped to build trust, and then further immersing into the therapy experience, right? Versus
because we have those conversations.
No, just versus keeping it at arm's length, right?
Yeah, because we have those conversations in the school system as well too. Majority of kids' teachers are white females, and I work at a school where majority of the students don't have a person of color, on their teaching roster in their classes. And we're having conversations with teachers to lean into that discomfort, where they're asking those questions to educate themselves on how they are impacting a student of color in the classroom. And it sounds like you guys are doing that work in the field that you all are doing as well.
We sure are trying.
Right. It's a long road, long uphill battle, but the work that you guys are doing, I definitely appreciate. How can people access the True Trauma Center once it is up and running?
Thank you for asking. So we have a website. People can find us at truetraumacenter.org. And there is a place there to reach out to us directly if people want information. We're also on social media. So we can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And we also have an old-fashioned phone number, so people can give us a call.
Right.
So that number I can give now, it's 240-389-4683.
Okay.
And we'll be making a more formal announcement in the fall when we're launching our clinical services. So we officially launched in the spring, just as an organization, kind of announcing here we are, and talking about kind of all of our plans, and kind of our identity and all of that. And so in the fall, when we're opening the doors, whether it's via virtually or in person or both, to start accepting kids and families for treatment. We're going to announce that pretty largely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm excited. Yeah, thank you. And another thing I can mention too is, we're looking for volunteers, all the time. If people, care about the mission and want to find a way to contribute, we're always looking for, like-minded folks to help out with the mission. And so,
partnership.
Absolutely.
We would love, we've begun kind of connecting with different organizations and individuals within our community to kind of see how we can better, help help each other. And again, I'm really grateful and thankful to you, Charles, for inviting us today to have these conversations and ask these questions, and and talk about your story and how it's impacted you, and to help others is really just incredible. And we welcome a chance to come back if you want to have us.
Absolutely. Definitely in the fall when you guys when the launch happens. Definitely we'll want to connect with you guys again.
Great.
So this is Dr. Renee DeBoer-Lucas and Dr. Stephanie Wolf, who are of the True Trauma Center that is up and coming this fall, where you can access everything trauma. These are two very wonderful individuals. I'm so glad they came on the show to share their expertise and to raise awareness for those individuals, children and adults and families who have and are experiencing trauma, whether you can get that trauma treated and also get that encouragement that you so desperately need. We want to thank Dr. Wolf and Dr. Lucas for joining the show today on the I Am Conquering Mountains podcast. Thank you all, and have a wonderful, awesome, and blessed day.
Thank you so much for having us. We love being here so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Hold on 1 second while I stop the record.
Sure.